I'm really happy to have you here. And my first presentation will be about Introduction to National Space Legislations. Actually, it will be the continuous of last year edition. And I will try to tell a little bit about the general things connected with the space law, as well as a little bit of details for my participants to take something from this conference and from this presentation. So I will focus on the overview of the space industry from the perspective of law, from the perspective of economy, from the perspective of numbers, of dangers, of our challenges that we need to face when it comes to the space law from the international perspective as well as from the private perspective. I will try to explain why actually we are dealing with the space law and with the national space legislations, what it is, why we need it, and why countries are dealing with that. Then I will try to introduce a basics of international space law, our 5 treaties that they are fundamentals and they are the core of acting with the national space legislations. And then I will go through national space legislations, the aim of them, the development of international law into national space legislations. And at the end, I will try to introduce you a little bit about the Polish space sector, how it looks like, what is the number of the entities dealing with the space industry in Poland. And I will tell you something about the working of the Act of National Space Legislation, because we are in the process of drafting it in Poland, and I hope that it will be visible next year, because it should be this year, but the things changed, and I hope that it will come into force next year. So that's the charter, which represents the difference between 2005 and 2023. It's based on the Starlink constellation. I hope that you have heard about the Starlink constellation, Elon Musk issues, etc. So this chart shows actually only the satellites and objects that are more than 100 kilograms. The one Starlink satellites, it's like 260 kilograms. But don't forget that there are a lot of smaller space objects around the Earth. They are even like 1 millimeters, 1 centimeters, and they are extremely dangerous because the gravitation is not there, so they can cause a lot of mess in the outer space. And this chart only shows how it goes up from the 2019, and that's only Starlink's constellation. We have also the OneWeb constellations, we have also another satellites, and actually this is also focused on the low Earth orbit. We have low Earth orbit, middle Earth orbit, and the highest one, geostationary orbit, and it depends on which orbit the satellites are launched. So this one is just the closer one, and it's the most crowded one. Here you have some economic perspective. What is it in the numbers? So that's that charts are in the billions of US dollars, and you can see that the most of the space ecosystems is concentrated on the commercial issues. We have also the governmental and civil one, as well as defense one. So please remember that we have the most, the biggest amount is the commercial one. Another thing is that the space industry and space market is mostly focused on the services. As you can see, it's 364 billions. Then we have manufacturing. Then we have the operations, launching, and ground segments. So every ground-based elements of the space industry. For example, controlling the space flights or somehow distributing the space data that you obtain from the satellites. And applications, the most of them are focused on the satellite navigations, then the satellite communications, Earth observations, and others. As I said, the commercial issues are the most important here, then the governmental and civilian one, and defense one. And at the end you have the regional selections of. So of course the North America and USA are the best one in this. Then we have Asia, Russia, and all of the part of the world. What are the consequences of that amount of launching and satellites? I just want to say that before 2010, the annual launching was around 200 launchings per year. Now, in 2021, we have almost 2,000 because of the Starlinks, because of the small satellites, because of the constellations. And because of it, the orbit is really, really crowded, especially the low Earth orbit. So there is a possibility of collisions, of explosions, of breakups, and all of these parts are visible on the last picture. So there are the space debris that are orbiting the Earth. And it's only, I would say, they are even like 1 millimeters and 1 centimeters object that they can cause or they can destroy the satellite. For example, there was 2 years ago, I think it was the anti-destructive satellite test. Russia made a test that destroyed their own satellite, which was non-functional from the Earth, and it caused so many debris that the astronauts from the International Space Stations needed to make an evacuations measure. So it even somehow caused the danger for the astronauts that are in the International Space Stations. That's the space debris in the numbers. So number of debris objects regularly tracked by Space Surveillance Network. They are tracking all of the space objects that they can. And it's like almost 35,000. Then we have estimated number of explosions, collisions, breaks up, or anomalous events resulting in fragmentations is less than 640. Then we have a total mass of all space objects in Earth orbit, and it's less than 11,000 tons. And it's just of 12 September 2023. These numbers are growing really fast. Actually, there was some model, I would say, they predicted if the Kessler syndrome is the syndrome that even if we will not launching more objects into the space, there will be so many objects into the space that they can collide to each other. So they actually estimated some I would say predictions that it will cost worldwide if this Kessler syndrome will appear. It will be around 200 billions US dollars of costs of this syndrome. So that's the reason that actually we need a space law. And in a space law industry, I would say, or in the space law community, we have 5 treaties that they were written more than decades, like 6 decades ago. So it was Outer Space Treaty, which is actually the fundamental of our space law. Then we had the Liability Convention, the Rescue Agreement, the Registration Convention, and the Moon Agreement, which was the last, but it was not that much successful. So some of the countries, they are not actually accepting Moon Agreement as a core of the, of course it's a core of the international space law, but still not a lot of countries ratified it, so it's not that important, I would say. And in the, I will focus on actually 2 of them, the Outer Space Treaty as well as the Registration Convention. Of course, there is a Liability Convention, which is actually prolong the provisions from the Outer Space Treaty. But the most important here for the national space legislations and for the states are, for example, Article 6, which states that the activities of non-governmental entities in outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, shall require authorization and continuing supervision by the appropriate state party to the treaty. So it's all about, and not all about, but here the important part is non-governmental entities. So the state is responsible for commercial activities in the outer space. Article 7 states that each state party to the treaty that launches or procures the launch of an object into outer space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, is internationally liable for damage to another state party to the treaty. So it's internationally liable for the damage of non-governmental entity. Then Article 8, which states about jurisdiction and control over such object, and from the Registration Convention, the obligation to register all of the objects that are launched into space in the national registry, despite of the general registry, which is available at the UN level, and it's from it's of course publicly available, so you can always check what is registered then. But instead of that, you need to have the state need to have the national registry. Okay, so why we need space law and national space law on the national level? minimum regulations which are from the international space law. It means licensing, supervision, national registry of space objects and liability. So that's the implementations of the previous mentioned regulations. But the national space legislations also can develop somehow these regulations from international space law, but of course in line with these provisions. So, for example, we can use national space legislations for development of competences, increased competitiveness, to reduction of risk, to reduce the risk, to create an appropriate environment from the indigenous space sector, and stable legal framework, for example, for investments. And some of the space stakeholders that they are in the national space industry, they need the space law to boost a little bit their companies, their research institution, the whole space sector. Of course, a lot of countries have national space strategies. They have already relevant authorities, for example, Polish Space Agency. We have a lot of national space agencies. And there is a huge space sector who need it. So Poland, for example, has like 400 entities, Czech Republic around 280, Hungary around 150, and Greece around 75. It's according to this ASCEA Star portal, which is connected with the tendering procedures from the European Space Agency. I will just check my time because I don't want to say too long. Okay, so there are actually some models about how to drafting the space law. And we have, for example, SOFIA model on model law on national space legislations, which was adopted in 2012, and General Assembly resolution on regulations concerning the recommendations of national space legislations, etc. So they are actually only the basics how the countries should regulate the space sector and space industry. So most of the countries in Europe, I will just indicate that actually from the members of European Space Agency, more of them have the national space legislations. A lot of them are in the process of creating this national space legislation, and the rest, they are thinking about it. So we are in a good path, and most of the national space legislations and the acts are connected with the scope, with the definitions to what to regulate actually in the space industry, to not over-regulate it or not regulate it at all. We have authorizations, we have supervision, we have licensing procedures, which is quite complicated, to be honest, because the space industry is really technological, really advanced, so it's really hard to check the requirements that the company, for example, need to have. We have environmental issue, as I indicated before about the space debris, and liability and right to recourse from the state to if the company will make a damage in outer space. And the Polish case. The strategic objectives by 2030, I will not read it, so you can check what Poland wants to actually do. And one of the objectives, it's objective number 4, is to create favorable conditions for the development of the space sector in Poland by, for example, creating and develop the law on the National Register of Space Objects. But it's just one element of the National Space Law. It's about the registration obligation, but still we need to have another element in our draft act. And here, I'm sorry that I have not translated to English, but it's quite a rare analysis, so I just prefer to leave it as it is in original. So that's the Polish space sector as of 2020, so it was 3 years ago. And we, as I mentioned, we have approximately 350 entities that dealing with the space industry, or 400 entities. Of course, they are not like 100% focused on the space industry. They are just like have some elements that are connected with the space. And for example, here are the space stakeholders of Polish space industry. It's like research and developments as well as universities is 21%. The entrepreneurs is 79%. The entities of Polish space sector, it's like small and middle enterprises is 60% and big companies it's 40%. And the structure of the entities, it's like research institution, it's 24%, and the entrepreneurs it's 76%. Of course, it was in 2020. We are like 3 years later, and actually we improved a lot because we raised the contribution to the European Space Agency more than twice. We have already our own astronaut who will fly, I hope next year, to on a commercial flight to the International Space Station. And Polish space law. Actually, we started to drafting Polish space law in 2012 when the Polish joined the European Space Agency, but the process, of course, is long. And the first published draft of Polish space law was in 2017. We also have one from 2020, and right now we are working on improving this and working on national space legislation to have this act done. So what we are actually covered in this 2017 draft, we covered the scope like territorial and personal jurisdictions, definitions like space activities, space object, operator, launching state, and damage. We gave the authorization and supervision as well as maintenance to the register for the responsibility of the President of the Polish Space Agency. Of course, there are liability issues and insurance, which is needed in the space industry, and which is quite high, and of course penalties, but that's the draft. We have already the act of the Polish Space Agency, which was amended recently and gave the Polish Space Agency a little bit more I would say, actions to help the Polish space industry. So provisions amended a little bit. And here I would like to present you on an example of definition of space activities. So what actually is regulated in the space law on the basis of the space activities. And for example, in Poland, space activities means the launching of a space object into space, the exploitation of a space object, and the bringing of a space object to Earth. It's not like official translation, so it's approximately like this. In Slovenia, space activity shall mean the launch of space object into outer space, the operation and operational control of the space object in outer space, and the control termination of the space object, etc. In Austria, it's the launch, operation, or control of a space object, as well as the operation of launch facility. And in United Arab Emirates, the act actually was improved recently, and it was somehow developed, and activities that target the identified area which is defined too, including this discovery, making an impact thereon, using or utilizing it in accordance with the provision of article of this law. So as you can see here, the defined was the midstream, actually midstream activities, so launching and operations of the object's facility, not the downstream, not the upstream, but the midstream, and most of the countries are focusing on that area. Before conclusion, I just want to point out that a lot of countries introduce laws which mean to somehow boost the sector. For example, Luxembourg introduced the possibility of own the space resources, which is quite controversial regarding to international law, which states something a little bit different. I would say not even a little bit, but it's quite controversial. For example, UK is developing the law regarding the possibility to launch from the spaceports or suborbital flights. The Portugal has a lot of conditions that are easier to meet when it comes to licensing process, because they, for example, have 3 types of licensing, which aimed to somehow fasten the whole process of obtaining the licenses. And United Arab Emirates as well, they have some provisions regarding the space resources. So the conclusion is why we actually need this national space legislation, and the existence of space law is necessary to grow the potential of the national space sector. The law provides stable basis for the development of space activities, and the drafted law should also be flexible, because the space technology is always changing and we need to adjust for that. So thank you very much.